security? The answer is yes. Consider the following list. Michael McCasey, recently appointed as U.S. Attorney General. McCasey also was the judge in the litigation between developer Larry Silverstein and several insurance companies arising from the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11/2001. Michael Chertoff, former Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at the Justice Department, now head of Homeland Security. Richard Pearl, one of Bush's foreign policy advisors. He is the chairman of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. A very likely Israeli government agent, Pearl was expelled from Senator Henry Jackson's office in the 1970s after the National Security Agency, or NSA, caught him passing highly classified national security documents to the Israeli embassy. He later worked for the Israeli weapons firm Soltam. Pearl came from a pro-Israel think tank, the AEI. Pearl is one of the leading pro-Israeli fanatics leading this Iraq warmongering within the administration and now in the media. Paul Wolfowitz, former Deputy Defense Secretary and member of Pearl's Defense Policy Board in the Pentagon. Wolfowitz is a close associate of Pearl and reportedly has close ties to the Israeli military. His sister lives in Israel. Wolfowitz came from the Jewish think tank Jensa. Wolfowitz was the number 2 leader within the administration behind this Iraq warmongering. He later was appointed head of the World Bank, but resigned under pressure from World Bank members over a scandal involving his misuse of power. Lawrence or Larry Franklin, the former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst with expertise in Iranian policy issues, who worked in the office of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith and reported directly to Feith's deputy William Lutey, was sentenced 20th January 2006 to, quote, more than 12 years in prison for giving classified information to an Israeli diplomat, unquote. And members of the pro-Israel lobbying group American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. Franklin will, quote, remain free while the government continues with the wider case, unquote, and his, quote, prison time could be sharply reduced in return for his help in prosecuting, unquote, former AIPAC members Stephen J. Rosen and Keith Wiseman. As an update to this, the trial with these AIPAC spies has been postponed indefinitely. How could the trial be postponed indefinitely? Kevin DeGregory was the head prosecuting attorney, but weeks prior to the trial, he had retired from his position as prosecutor to go work for a Jewish law firm. Douglas Feith, Undersecretary of Defense and Policy Advisor at the Pentagon. He is a close associate of Pearl and served as his special counsel. Like Pearl and the others, Feith is a pro-Israel extremist who has advocated anti-Arab policies in the past. He is closely associated with the extremist group the Zionist Organization of America, which even attacks Jews that don't agree with its extremist views. Feith frequently speaks at ZOA conferences. Feith runs a small law firm, Feith & Zell, which only has one international office in Israel. The majority of their legal work is representing Israeli interests. His firm's own website stated prior to his appointment that Feith, quote, represents Israeli armaments manufacturer, unquote. Feith basically represents the Israeli war machine. Feith also came from the Jewish think tank Jensa. Feith, like Pearl and Wolfowitz, are campaigning hard for the continuation of the Israeli proxy wars against Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. Feith was investigated by the FBI under suspicion of leaking classified information to Israel, being that he was Larry Franklin's boss when Franklin leaked those documents to Rosen and Wiseman of AIPAC. For that, he was forced to leave the National Security Council. Feith was also investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee for sexing up intelligence that was used to justify invading Iraq. Edward Lutwick, member of the National Security Study Group of the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. Lutwick is reportedly an Israeli citizen and has taught in Israel. He frequently writes for Israeli and pro-Israeli newspapers and journals. Lutwick is an Israeli extremist whose main theme in many of his articles is the necessity of the U.S. waging war against Iraq and Iran. Henry Kissinger, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Kissinger sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl. Unfortunately, President Bush nominated Kissinger as chairman of the September 11th Investigating Commission. It's like picking a bank robber to investigate a fraud scandal. He later declined this job under enormous protests. Dov Zakheim. Dov Zakheim is an ordained rabbi and reportedly holds Israeli citizenship. Zakheim attended Jews College in London and became an ordained Orthodox Jewish rabbi in 1973. He was adjunct professor at New York's Jewish Yeshiva University. Zakheim is close to the Israeli lobby. Dov Zakheim is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, and in 2000 a co-author of the project for the New American Century's position paper titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, advocating the necessity for a Pearl Harbor-like incident to mobilize the country into war with Israel's enemies, mostly Middle Eastern Muslim nations. He was appointed by Bush as Pentagon Comptroller from 4th May 2001 to 10th March 2004. At that time, he was unable to explain the disappearance of $1 trillion. Actually, nearly 3 years earlier, Donald Rumsfeld announced on 10th September 2001 that an audit discovered $2.3 trillion was also missing from the Pentagon books. That story, as mentioned, was buried under 9/11's rubble. The two sums disappeared under Zakheim's watch. Despite these suspicions, on 6th May 2004, Zakheim took a lucrative position at Bose Allen Hamilton, one of the most prestigious strategy consulting firms in the world. One of its clients then was Blessed Relief, a charity said to be a front for Osama bin Laden. Bose Allen and Hamilton then also worked closely with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense. Intelligence concerning Dov tells us that he is a dual Israeli-American citizen and has been tracking the halls of the U.S. government for 25 years, casting defense policy and influence on Presidents Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. Further intelligence points out that most of Israel's armaments were gotten thanks to him. Squads of U.S. F-16s and F-15s were classified as military surplus and sold to Israel at a fraction of their value. Kenneth Edelman, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Edelman also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Edelman frequently is a guest on Fox News and often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. Through his ignorance, he actually called Arabs anti-Semitic on Fox News, dated 28 November 2001, when he could have looked it up in the dictionary to find out that Arabs, by definition, are Semitic people. They are Semites. Louis Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's ex-chief of staff, as chief pro-Israel Jewish advisor to Cheney, it helps explain why Cheney is so gun-ho to invade Iran. Libby is longtime associate of Wolfowitz. Libby was also a lawyer for convicted felon and Israeli spy Mark Rich, whom Clinton pardoned in his last days as president. Libby was recently found guilty of lying to federal investigators in the Valerie Plame affair, in which Plame, a covert CIA agent, was exposed for political revenge by the Bush administration following her husband's revelations about the lies leading to the Iraq War. Robert Satloff, U.S. National Security Council advisor, Satloff was the executive director of the Israeli lobby's think tank, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Many of the Israeli lobby's experts come from this front group, like Martin Indyk. Elliot Abrams, National Security Council advisor, he previously worked at Washington-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. During the Reagan administration, Abrams was the Assistant Secretary of State, handling, for the most part, Latin American affairs. Played an important role in the Iran-Contra scandal, which involved illegally selling U.S. weapons to Iran to fight Iraq, and illegally funding the Contra rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. He also actively deceived 3 congressional committees about his involvement and thereby faced felony charges based on his testimony. Abrams pled guilty in 1991 to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to a year's probation and 100 hours of community service. A year later, former President Bush Sr. granted Abrams a full pardon. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Reagan administration's State Department. Mark Grossman, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources at the Department of State. Grossman is one of many of the pro-Israel Jewish officials from the Clinton administration that Bush has promoted to higher posts. Richard Haass, Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and Ambassador at Large. He is also Director of National Security Programs and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the first Bush senior administration who sat on the National Security Council and who consistently advocated going to war against Iraq. Haass is also a member of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. Robert Zoellick, U.S. Trade Representative, a cabinet-level position. He is also one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Bush Jr. administration who advocated invading Iraq and occupying a portion of the country in order to set up a Vichy-style puppet government. He consistently advocates going to war against Iran. Ari Fleischer, ex-White House spokesman for the Bush Jr. administration. Prominent in the Jewish community, some reports state that he holds Israeli citizenship. Fleischer is closely connected to the extremist Jewish group called the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidics, who follow the Kabbalah and hold very extremist and insulting views on non-Jews. Fleischer was the co-president of Chabad's Capital Jewish Forum. He received the Young Leadership Award from the American Friends of Lubavitch in October 2001. James Schlesinger, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Schlesinger also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Schlesinger is also a commissioner of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. David Frum, White House speechwriter behind the Axis of Evil label, he lumped together all the lies and accusations against Iraq for Bush to justify the war. Joshua Bolten, White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Bolten was previously a banker, former legislative aide, and prominent in the Jewish community. John Bolton, former UN representative and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Bolton is also a senior advisor to President Bush. Prior to this position, Bolton was